Yeah, thank you, Clem. Thank you, colleagues. Sorry for missing this earlier session. Sometimes you also have to share your time. Unlike a shared society, which everybody can share, you cannot share your time always equally. But thank you for the opportunity. Patricia asked me whether I can just share with you her slides, so I'm trying my best to interpret what she has done and get some message through. And I would very much like also for you to, if you can, record your questions, which we can then send to Patricia to have a look at for the further development of this work. The focus is very much on armed conflict, at the cost of conflict, and then the relationship between inequality and cost, and the breakdown of a shared society due to conflict, but also what does the lack of a shared society means for the possibility that countries get into conflict. Will all societies that are not shared become embroiled in conflict? And this is some of the complexities that Patricia discusses. She also specifically focused very much on issues of institution building and saying, well, good institutions are very important, a part of shared societies, but how do they come about? And in a conflict situation, you should take care of the fact that many of the institutions are shaped by the nature of the violence and the nature of the conflict itself. So let's go through some of the important points. I think one of the factors that makes the achievement of shared societies very complex today is that huge numbers of people are affected by conflict. 1.5 billion people affected by armed conflict. I think related to this, the World Bank's World Development Report 2011, which focused on conflict and post-conflict societies in fragile state, we're making the point that not a single one of the conflict-affected countries in the world will meet any one of the Millennium Development Goals by 2015. And so people are affected all through the world. So this means that chances of people living in shared societies in many countries are so far off. They also contain 1/3 of those living in extreme poverty and are responsible for over half of all child mortality in the world. So ending conflict and ending them sustainably and understanding how the conflict has shaped the inequalities in society is very important in establishing a shared society. And the point as well that Patricia makes is that while the incidence of internal armed conflict has decreased in recent years, the legacy of violence still persists, which affects the sustainability of peace, of democracy building, and the living conditions of households. I think an important point also to emerge from this is that most of the conflicts today in the world is not between countries anymore, it's within countries. It's civil conflicts that are most of the mass conflicts. And this is also very important to understand, I think perhaps, the reasons for the conflict and the importance, I think, of building socially shared societies. The slide here shows that there are two important areas of institutional change to take into consideration if we think about armed conflict and shared societies, or the lack thereof. The first is the questions of trust and cooperation, which I think was yesterday also very much mentioned, and which also makes me think about that Kenneth Arrow already said back in 1972 that you can trace most instances of underdevelopment to a lack of trust in society. So it as very key. And that basically when the breakdown of trust and cooperation takes place, then you have the possibility of armed conflict being very high. But there's also the question of alternative systems of governance. It's something that will come out later in the slides as well, that very often in conflict and post-conflict situations where government services are broken down, there are alternative arrangements, informal organizations, grassroots organizations that provide many of these services and public goods to people. And these can also create permanent forms of institutions that needs to be taken into account for peace. Interesting thing that I mentioned yesterday in the presentation and in the paper is whether violence is a means to achieve a shared society, which I mentioned may be controversial. She discusses the other fact that very often conflict takes place because people feel that they are fighting for something that's worth fighting. So if they are fighting to establish a society, some form of conflict is necessary. I think Sarah's presentation also with the Occupy Wall Street, I mean, implicit therein is conflict. Occupy Wall Street, sees civil disobedience and so forth as something that they are willing to engage in. Also the list that Rob showed us, there is also illegal protest and so forth that people engage in making the point known. So this is something to think about. She all makes the point that many explanations of how modern societies have emerged comes from conflict and the processes of conflict. In one of the work that UNU Wider commissioned a couple of years ago by Arjun Chang was also containing a chapter on the dark origins of good institutions. And examples you find throughout the world today. I mean, if you think about some of the prosperity in the UK, it's been based on the military success of the Royal Navy, which was created to be privateers against opposition. It was not created for good reasons. A more recent one is also in the South African case, which you mentioned, that financial sanctions was very successful due to the boycotts. But that forced the government to create a very efficient tax system to obtain internal revenue. And today the tax system is being very effectively used, as Jan had shown, for transfer payments and creating social pension systems and so on, and having a good tax base for the government to address social upliftment and social cohesion. So the point is that very often institutions that today in shared societies mean quite a lot sometimes originate in less sound and less promising conditions. And this is also something to keep in mind when one addresses a conflict situation. If you want to move to a shared society, are you going to ignore all the institutions that currently exist, or are you going to see whether the current institutional arrangements may in fact play a very positive role in the future shared society that you want to create? The question has always been asked whether inequality and exclusion will lead to armed conflict. And Patricia has done a lot of work also in the Microcon project, which will result in a book next year on the micro level, on the relationships and the impacts of conflict and the causes of conflict. And it does seem in her evidence that there is an association between inequality and violence, and that the relationship seems to be persistent. Countries with persistently high levels of dysfunctional inequalities are less successful at establishing shared societies and more likely to see the use of violence as a means to resolving social conflict. These I will quickly skip over. Daniel will also know some of these to compare some of the countries. You can see that countries that are doing very poorly in terms of global peace rankings. The same in terms of crime rates per region tend also to be higher in countries where income inequality tend to be higher. This is what the relationship in this graph tends to show us. That it's people's relative position in society which may be a trigger for crime and also for violence. The question is, when does inequality and exclusion lead to violent conflict? The important thing here is that she says that the statistical evidence over many studies and many periods shows that the relationship between grievances and civil wars is not really very strong. So it seems that the economic and other motivations for civil conflict is much stronger